Have you ever been told something so confidently, so repeatedly that you almost believe it yourself until one moment shattered that illusion for decades? A quiet insult has lingered in the air whenever the Philippines is mentioned in the context of language. They don't really speak English, not the real English. Those words have been whispered by foreigners, chuckled at in boardrooms, and even written in articles by so-called experts. It is not shouted. It is murmured as if the world had agreed upon it long ago. And yet, it cuts deep like a blade hidden beneath politeness. What if I told you that one of the most respected professors at Harvard University, yes, Harvard, the symbol of academic authority, once repeated this claim, not in malice, not in anger, but with the confidence of someone who believed he was stating fact? Imagine that. The Philippines, a nation with over 100 years of English tradition, dismissed in a single breath by a scholar who had never truly listened. And yet here lies the microshock. That same professor months later found himself standing before a packed lecture hall, his voice trembling, his eyes lingering on a single sentence written on the screen. Filipinos speak English more fluently than most native speakers I have met. But before we reach that moment, before we hear those words that silenced an auditorium, we must go back, because every awakening begins with ignorance. Every confession begins with denial. The story starts not in Manila, not in Harvard, but in a dimly lit conference room in Geneva, Switzerland. There, a group of international educators had gathered, each presenting their insights on global communication. At the center of it all was Professor Andrew Whitmore, a man in his late 50s. A scholar of linguistics, respected, admired, and often feared for his uncompromising critiques. To many, his word was law. That evening, over coffee and quiet laughter, someone asked him casually, "Professor, what do you make of English in the Philippines?" "They say it is everywhere there." He adjusted his glasses, leaned back, and with a faint smile replied, "It is everywhere, yes, but let us be honest. It is not real English. It is a form, a version, but not the kind you would expect at Harvard." There was laughter round the table. Some nodded, others stayed silent, and somewhere across the ocean, an entire nation remained unaware of the insult tossed so effortlessly against. But words have strange journeys. They travel, they echo, they find their way into unexpected corners, and that single remark, dismissive, almost careless, would return to him in a way he never expected. A few months later, Professor Whitmore accepted an invitation to visit the Philippines. He had been asked to speak at a forum on global education to share his expertise with Filipino teachers and policymakers. He arrived with the arrogance of a man who believed he was stepping into a land eager to learn from him, not realizing that it was he who would be taught. The first moment that struck him happened not in a conference, not in a lecture hall, but in the back of a taxi. His driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, but a polite smile, struck up a conversation. "Sir, welcome to Manila. First time here?" The professor nodded, half distracted, until he realized something peculiar. The driver's English, fluid, precise, and laced with gentle humor, was as clear as any he had heard in London or Boston. He brushed it aside. Coincidence, he told himself. One man does not define a nation. But then at the hotel reception, the staff switched effortlessly between English, Tagalog, and even Japanese as they handled guests with grace. At dinner, a young waiter recommended dishes with words so carefully chosen, it felt like he had been trained in diplomacy. And for the first time in a long while, Professor Whitmore fell silent. Not convinced. Not yet, but unsettled. That night, as he stood on his hotel balcony overlooking the Manila skyline, the city lights flickering like restless fireflies, he whispered to himself, "Could I have been wrong?" Little did he know this question was only the beginning, because in the days that followed he would be confronted with moments that not only challenged his assumptions but shattered them completely. Until the man who once dismissed Filipino English as inferior would stand before the world and admit the truth that had been hidden too long. When Professor Andrew Whitmore woke up the next morning, The humid Manila air carried with it a sense of restlessness. He had spent his life dissecting language, reducing it to rules, syntax, and structure. But here in the Philippines, something unsettled him. It wasn't just the fluency he had noticed in the taxi driver or the polished grace of the hotel staff. It was something deeper, something harder to explain. The conference was 2 days away, and so he had time to explore. His hosts encouraged him to see the city for himself, to walk its streets and feel its rhythm. At first, he resisted. He was a man of books, not sidewalks. But curiosity tugged at him. So he set out, notebook in hand, expecting nothing more than an ordinary walk. Instead, he stumbled into 3 moments that would begin to erode the certainty he once held. The first came at a small cafe near Intramuros, the historic heart of Manila. He ordered a coffee. Simple enough, and sat by the window as morning light poured in. At the next table, 3 students were huddled together, their laptops open, papers scattered across the wood. He tried not to eavesdrop, but their voices carried. They were debating fluently, passionately, in English the nuances of a political theory he had lectured on at Harvard only months earlier. Their words were precise, their logic sharp, their vocabulary rich. One girl even quoted a philosopher in French before translating it smoothly into English for her friends. He lowered his pen. These were not just students speaking functional English. These were minds wielding the language as a tool, as an instrument of thought. They reminded him of his brightest graduate students back in Cambridge, and yet they were here in Manila speaking with confidence and depth. The second moment happened in the most unexpected place. A marketplace. He wandered into the chaos of Divisoria where stalls overflowed with colors, fabrics, spices, and noise. At first, he felt overwhelmed, but soon he noticed something remarkable. Vendors juggling customers from Korea, China, the Middle East, and the West switched languages with ease, English being the bridge that connected them all. One young woman, no older than 20, spoke to a Japanese buyer in halting Japanese, then turned to a group of Europeans and explained prices in fluent English. Her tone respectful yet assertive. The professor lingered near her stall, pretending to browse, listening carefully. There was no hesitation, no awkward pause as she moved between tongues. He had studied bilingualism for decades. But here it was in practice, raw and alive. This was not broken English. This was mastery in motion, shaped not in classrooms, but in the crucible of survival and connection. The third moment struck him like a silent blow. It was evening, and he found himself in a modest chapel, tucked between tall buildings. He had been drawn in by the sound of singing, soft yet powerful. Inside, a small congregation was reciting prayers in English, their voices rising in unison. There was no stumbling, no searching for words. The language flowed seamlessly, as if it belonged not to another nation, but to their very soul. What startled him most was not the fluency, but the reverence. These were not rehearsed lines, not foreign phrases forced into mouths that did not own them. These were words spoken with devotion, faith wrapped in English syllables, transformed into something uniquely Filipino. He closed his eyes, listening, and for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, a lump rising in his throat, an ache in his chest. As he walked back to his hotel that night, the city's noise faded into a quiet hum inside his mind. 3 moments, students debating, vendors negotiating, worshippers praying, echoed louder than any lecture he had given. They revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. English in the Philippines was not an imitation, not a diluted version. It was alive, vibrant, and authentic, rooted in everyday life and elevated by spirit. And yet, he wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. His pride resisted. His reputation anchored him to old beliefs. After all, how could a single scholar revered at Harvard suddenly confess he had been wrong for decades? The thought of standing before his peers and retracting his words terrified him. But something inside him had shifted. His arrogance was cracking, replaced by questions he could not silence. As he stood again on his hotel balcony, gazing at the city lights, He whispered the same words as the night before, only softer, more uncertain. Could I have been wrong? And deep down, though he would not yet admit it, he already knew the answer. The day of the conference arrived. The hotel ballroom had been transformed into a polished stage for international dialogue. Flags lined the walls, nameplates rested neatly on long tables, and rows of seats stretched across the floor, already filling with teachers, journalists, students, and policymakers from across the Philippines. Cameras stood ready at the back, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Professor Andrew Whitmore adjusted his tie, clutching the notes he had prepared weeks earlier in Cambridge. He had spoken at countless conferences in Europe and America, always confident, always in control. This, he told himself, would be no different. Yet a small unease stirred inside him. The moments he had witnessed in Manila still clung to his mind. The cafe debates, the market negotiations, the prayers in English echoing in that small chapel. He tried to push them aside. This was his domain. He was the expert. The host introduced him warmly, calling him one of the world's foremost voices on global English. Applause filled the hall. He stepped to the podium, smiling with professional ease, and began. At first, his lecture was smooth. He spoke about the history of English, about its global spread, about the ways in which it had adapted in different regions. He listed statistics, offered witty anecdotes, and the audience listened politely. But then, without meaning to, he repeated the phrase that had once slipped so casually from his mouth in Geneva. Of course, in some countries, like the Philippines, what you hear is not quite real English. It is functional, yes, but not what we would consider at Harvard as the standard. The words hung in the air like smoke. He sensed the shift immediately. The room did not erupt in anger, but something colder happened. Silence, a silence thick enough to press against his chest. He looked up, expecting blank stares, but instead found eyes that were steady, unflinching, and quietly defiant. And then something unexpected. A hand rose from the audience. It belonged to a woman in her 40s, dressed simply in a blouse and slacks, her ID badge marking her as a public school teacher from Quezon City. "Professor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "may I respond?" He hesitated. No one usually interrupted his lectures, but the silence in the room seemed to give her permission. "Of course," he said. She stood holding a microphone. "I teach children from the poorest parts of Manila," she said. "Many of them go home to houses with no electricity, no running water. But when they stand in front of my class, they recite poems in English. They write essays in English. They debate in English. And when I ask them why they try so hard, they tell me because English is the bridge to the world." Her words were steady, but her eyes glistened. "You call it not real, but for them it is the most real thing they have. The key to opportunity, the tool that lets their voices be heard beyond these streets." Applause began, soft at first, then growing. The professor felt heat rising in his face. He opened his mouth to reply, but another hand shot up. A young man, perhaps a university student, spoke next. "Professor, may I?" His English was crisp, his accent neutral, his tone respectful. "You say we do not speak real English, but may I ask, how do you define real? Is it grammar? Is it accent? Is it the way your professors in Cambridge speak?" He paused, then smiled gently. "Because if you define real English as the ability to communicate ideas, to move people, to shape the future, then perhaps it is here in the Philippines where it lives most strongly." The applause grew louder. The professor's throat tightened. He looked out at the sea of faces, teachers, students, parents, and realized something shocking. They were not angry. They were not hostile. They were proud, unshaken, and utterly unwilling to let his words diminish them. In that moment, his notes felt heavy, useless. He placed them down on the podium. His carefully crafted lecture no longer mattered. Instead, what stared back at him was a mirror, reflecting not the flaws of Filipino English, but the blindness of his own assumptions. He took a deep breath. For the first time in his career, He abandoned the script. "I must confess," he said slowly, his voice quieter than before, "that I came here to teach. But perhaps I am the one who needs to learn." The room fell silent again. But this time it was a silence filled with anticipation, like the pause before a storm breaks. And deep inside, the professor felt the beginning of something he had long resisted: humility. That night after the conference, Professor Andrew Whitmore could not sleep. The applause still echoed in his ears. Not the kind of applause he was used to, admiring and questioning, but an applause that carried conviction, defiance, and pride. He had been challenged not by fellow professors or scholars in ivory towers, but by ordinary Filipinos, teachers, students, parents, armed with nothing more than their voices and their truths. He sat at the desk in his hotel room, his notes spread before him like relics of another life. Every page suddenly felt hollow. He had spent decades constructing theories, publishing books, lecturing to eager audiences. Yet here he was, undone not by arguments written in journals, but by words spoken in accents he once dismissed. The next day he was invited to visit a public high school in Manila. His hosts thought it would be good for him to see the grassroots of Filipino education. Part of him wanted to decline, but something inside whispered that he had no right to turn away. The school was modest, its paint chipped, its classrooms crowded, children spilled into hallways, their laughter echoing against the walls. He was ushered into a classroom where 30 students waited, their eyes wide with excitement. They had prepared a small program in his honor, unaware of the storm raging in his mind. One by one, the students stood too. Present, a boy recited Shakespeare with flawless rhythm, his voice rising with emotion that seemed to mature for his age. A girl delivered a speech on climate change, her English crisp, her passion undeniable. Then a group performed a debate tackling a political issue with sharp arguments and clever rebuttals. The professor sat frozen. It was not just their fluency. It was the way they owned the language, bending it to their thoughts, their humor, their convictions. It was no longer the English of Cambridge or Boston. It was Filipino English, alive, expressive, unafraid. But it was the final moment that broke him. A young girl, no older than 12, stepped forward with a worn notebook in her hands. Her uniform was slightly faded, her shoes scuffed, but her eyes shone. She began to read an essay she had written titled "My Voice Matters." Her English was simple, not dressed in complicated words, but every sentence carried weight. She wrote about her father, a construction worker abroad, who called home every Sunday. She wrote about her mother, who worked late shifts but still prayed with her every night. And she wrote about her dream of becoming a lawyer so that when people say Filipinos do not speak real English, I can stand and speak for my people. Her voice trembled on that last line. And then she looked directly at him, straight into his eyes, not with anger, not with defiance, but with a quiet plea for recognition. Something inside him shattered. For years, he had worn the armor of academia, convinced that authority meant truth. But in that moment, standing before a 12-year-old girl in a crowded classroom in Manila, he realized how small his authority was compared to the weight of lived experience. He rose to his feet, unable to stay seated. The students stared at him, confused. His throat tightened, and before he could stop himself, his eyes blurred with tears. It had been decades since he had cried in public. But now the walls collapsed. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking. "I must tell you something," he said, looking at the girl, then at the class. "All my life, I believe I understood English better than anyone. I thought it belonged to the West, to Harvard, to Cambridge. But today you have shown me that English belongs to those who use it to give meaning, to give hope, to give truth, and no one does that more beautifully than you." The room fell utterly silent. The students stared wide-eyed as if trying to understand the weight of his confession. Then, slowly, the teacher at the back began to clap. One by one, the students followed until the small classroom erupted in applause that was louder, fuller, and more honest than anything he had ever heard in a grand auditorium. For the first time in his life, Professor Andrew Whitmore felt small. But it was not the smallness of humiliation. It was the smallness of humility. And in that humility, he felt free. That night when he returned to his hotel, he opened his laptop. He deleted the draft of his upcoming lecture. Instead, he began to write a new one that would change not only his reputation, but the way the world saw the Philippines, because he knew what he had to do. The world had laughed too long, doubted too long, dismissed too long. Now it was time to tell the truth. And he of all people would be the one to say it. Months later, the grand lecture hall at Harvard University filled with scholars, students, journalists, and diplomats. The banners of the prestigious institution hung proudly on the walls, their deep crimson shimmering under the golden lights. At the center stood Professor Andrew Whitmore, his hair grayer, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes carrying a clarity no one had seen before. This was no ordinary lecture. Word had spread quickly that the renowned linguist was going to address his controversial views on English in Asia. Some came expecting a defense. Others anticipated another dismissal. Few expected what was about to happen. He began with a pause, letting the silence wash over the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said slowly, his voice steady yet weighted with emotion. "For most of my career, I taught that English was the property of the West, that it belonged to those born into it, raised in it, shaped by it. And among my careless words, I once said that in the Philippines, people do not speak real English." There was a stir in the room, whispers moving like waves. He did not flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I stand before you today to tell you I was wrong." The words landed like thunder. The room froze, as if the air itself had thickened. He continued, "In Manila, I met children who debate Shakespeare with eloquence, vendors who bridge cultures with words, worshippers who pray in English with a reverence that humbled me. I met teachers who carry the language not as a foreign burden, but as a gift, and students who speak it with a conviction that I have rarely heard in Cambridge or Boston. I saw not imitation but authenticity, not brokenness, but brilliance." His voice began to tremble, but he pressed on. "English does not belong to Harvard. It does not belong to London or New York or Sydney. English belongs to those who use it to tell their truth. And in the Philippines, I found English more alive, more resilient, more beautiful than I ever imagined." The audience sat in stunned silence. Some scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Others simply stared. He let the words linger, then added almost in a whisper, "If you wish to hear the future of English, do not only come to Harvard. Go to Manila, go to Cebu, go to Davao. There you will find English not as a borrowed tongue, but as a living voice of a people who have claimed it as their own." For a moment no one moved. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling until the entire hall thundered with it. Professors stood, students cheered, journalists raised their cameras as flashes lit up the room. Yet in the middle of it all, Professor Whitmore closed his eyes, hearing not the applause of Harvard, but the voices of those Filipino students, that young girl with the scuffed shoes declaring that her voice mattered. Later, the news spread across the globe. Headlines blared, "Harvard professor admits Filipinos speak world-class English." Opinion pieces emerged, celebrating, debating, dissecting. But in the Philippines, the reaction was different. Teachers smiled through tears, parents shared the story with pride. Students whispered to one another in classrooms, "Did you hear what the professor said about us?" For once, the narrative was not about doubt, not about condescension. It was about recognition, about dignity. And perhaps the most important change was not in Harvard, not in the newspapers, but in the quiet confidence of Filipinos themselves. Because when the world had questioned them, when experts had dismissed them, they had continued to speak, to write, to pray, to dream in English. Yes, but also in their own indomitable spirit. And now, finally, the world was listening. Professor Whitmore would go on to write a book about his transformation, but the moment that mattered most was not bound in pages. It was that single confession spoken in a trembling voice before the world's most elite institution. "I was wrong. The Filipinos speak real English, perhaps even truer than mine. And as the story traveled, it became more than an academic admission. It became a symbol, a reminder that truth, no matter how long denied, has a way of rising for the people of the Philippines. It was more than vindication. It was a mirror reflecting what they had always known. That their voice mattered, that their words carried power, that their English was not less, but more. And somewhere in Manila, in a crowded classroom, a young girl with bright eyes and a worn notebook could smile, knowing that her dream had already come true. The world had heard her voice. So now I want to ask you, what do you feel when you hear this story? Does it remind you of your own childhood reciting poems in English at school? Or perhaps the voice of your father or mother speaking to you across oceans, holding on to words that carried both sacrifice and love? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the strength of our people. Leave a comment below. Tell the world your own story, your own journey with English, or the teacher who once told you your voice matters. And if you believe like I do that the world should finally recognize the truth about the Filipino spirit, then click like, subscribe, and help this message reach further. Not for me, not even for Harvard, but for every child, every parent, every Filipino who has ever been told. Your English is not real, because today we know the truth, and the world deserves to hear it from